fire, screams. A moment he could never take back. Now, decades later, a gray-haired veteran sits in silence, with only his dog at his feet and guilt in his eyes. The war never followed him home. It lived inside him. So when he stopped in front of a forgotten old warehouse one night, even he didn't know why his heart trembled. Was this the place where he would finally bury the past? Or the place where it would rise again? Cold mountain air rolled through the narrow valley as dusk settled over the small town, carrying with it the scent of pine, engine oil, and something older. Like quiet lives layered upon quiet lives. Samuel Reed drove his aging pickup truck slowly down the main road, his hand steady on the wheel, his posture upright, despite the years that had carved stiffness into his shoulders. At 59, he was tall, but lean now. The broad frame of his younger days narrowed by time and endurance rather than weakness. His hair was cut short and practical, silver heavy at the temples, the rest a dark gray that still clung stubbornly to youth. His face bore gentle lines around the eyes and mouth, the kind that came from a life of watching closely and speaking little. And under the fading daylight, his calm expression carried a weight most towns never learned to name. He wore his familiar red and black buffalo plaid shirt jacket over a cream-colored t-shirt, dark blue straight-leg jeans worn pale at the knees, and brown leather boots that had walked through more ground than most people ever would. On his left wrist, the military watch remained, its dark strap scuffed, but intact, a quiet relic that never left him. In the passenger seat sat Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd with alert amber eyes and a few pale scars hidden beneath thick fur along his shoulder and flank. Ranger's ears twitched at every sound, his body calm but coiled with awareness. The learned patience of a former working dog who never truly stopped working. As Samuel passed the post office and general store, he nodded to faces that knew him only as the quiet real estate man who showed houses by day and disappeared by night. He had arrived months ago without spectacle, rented a modest home at the edge of town, and slipped into the rhythm of listings and closings with a competence that spoke of discipline and reliability rather than ambition. Clients trusted him quickly. They said he listened more than he talked. They were right. When night came, Samuel returned to his small house, removed his boots carefully by the door, hung the red and black jacket on the back of a wooden chair, wiped dust from the watch face with the sleeve of his shirt, and sat in stillness as Ranger settled at his feet. In those quiet moments, memories rose without permission. Flashes of torn earth, shouted commands, hands slipping from his grasp, the weight of people he could not bring back. He never spoke those memories aloud. He carried them like old wounds that had learned to ache quietly rather than bleed. Ranger, as always, seemed to know when the weight pressed hardest. The dog would shift closer, place his large head against Samuel's knee, and breathe slow and steady, as if lending him borrowed calm. That evening, instead of turning into his driveway, Samuel slowed. The far edge of town, where trees leaned inward and the road curved toward the forgotten. There, half swallowed by brush and shadow, stood a sham. Abandoned warehouse. Its corrugated metal walls rusted into the color of dried blood, windows broken and boarded at uneven angles, the doors warped by years of neglect. Samuel parked across the road and sat for a long moment without speaking. Ranger lifted his head, ears sharp, reading not the building, but the man beside him. Samuel stepped out, boots crunching over gravel and fallen pine needles, and crossed slowly to the fence that had long ago surrendered its purpose. Up close, the building looked even more tired, yet beneath the decay stood a stubborn frame that had refused to collapse. Samuel studied it the way he studied land for his clients, not for what it was, but for what it could hold. The air was still, the sky a muted violet beyond the mountain ridge, and for the first time in weeks, his breath caught somewhere between memory and possibility. He leaned lightly against the fence, lowered his voice, as if afraid the building itself might hear him, and murmured, "Maybe this is where I begin again." Ranger pressed against his leg, tail swaying once, cautious but not afraid. Samuel remained there until the cold reached his bones, then turned back without another word, yet the image of the warehouse stayed with him as firmly as the old battles he never outran. That night, when he hung his jacket in the quiet kitchen and sat staring through the window above the sink, he did not see the dark yard beyond. He saw walls waiting to be reshaped, silence waiting to be filled, and a version of himself that might exist without running. But as sleep finally pulled him under, one question hovered where his thoughts had been. Would this quiet town ever truly accept a man who still carried a war behind his eyes? Morning light fell pale and angled across the courthouse steps as the town eased into another ordinary day, unaware that something quietly irreversible was about to be set in motion. Samuel Reed stood at the counter inside the small land registry office, his red and black buffalo plaid jacket folded neatly over one arm, the cream-colored t-shirt beneath it clean but softened by wear. Across from him, a clerk slid documents forward with routine efficiency, her voice calm, uncurious. Samuel signed where indicated with steady strokes, his military watch catching the light with each movement of his wrist. There was no hesitation in his posture, only a firm, practiced finality. The warehouse, rusted, forgotten, standing at the ragged edge of town, was his now. No fanfare followed the exchange, no questions asked beyond what the forms required. He thanked the clerk with a polite nod, tucked the papers into a weathered folder, and stepped back into daylight where Ranger waited at the base of the steps. The German shepherd rose immediately, 6 years old and powerful without being imposing. Amber eyes scanning the street before softening as Samuel approached. The dog's tail swayed once, controlled and quiet, as if he understood that something important had shifted. That evening, when the town's working hours drifted toward their natural close, Samuel drove not toward his small house, but toward the warehouse. Shadows stretched long across the road as the mountains swallowed the sun, and the building loomed darker than before, its silhouette no longer a curiosity, but a claim. Inside, the first strike of the hammer sounded almost timid, then found its rhythm. Metal groaned as old fasteners were loosened. Dust lifted into the single cone of yellow light Samuel had hung from a beam. He moved with economy, measured steps, deliberate hands, while Ranger circled once and settled near the door. The dog's ears remained upright, rotating slightly at every distant footstep, every shift of wind through broken siding. Night after night, that same muted ballet repeated itself. The truck arriving after sunset, the low glow behind boarded windows, the steady cadence of work that did not belong to desperation, but to intention. It did not go unnoticed. Across the street from the general store, in a narrow brick-front bakery that smelled permanently of sugar and yeast, Margaret Ellis watched from behind her display window as Samuel's truck rolled past at the same hour each evening. Margaret was in her early 60s, with short iron gray hair brushed back from a broad, expressive face that carried both warmth and gravity. Years of early mornings had curved her shoulders slightly forward, but her movements remained brisk, purposeful, and she missed very little. She had owned the bakery for 3 decades, long enough to recognize patterns and the people who fit or didn't fit within them. Beside her, one afternoon, stood Erin Walker, a woman in her early 30s with tired eyes that still tried to be hopeful. Erin's dark hair was usually pulled into a messy knot at the nape of her neck, her clothes chosen more for practicality than style. She worked part-time since her husband had left, raising her young son alone on tight margins and quiet determination. Both women had noticed the same thing. The quiet realtor who never lingered, never drank at the bar, never joined the easy talk on the sidewalk, now disappearing each night beyond the edge of town. "He bought that old warehouse yesterday," Margaret said softly, sliding a loaf from the oven. Erin's brows drew together. "Why would a man who sells houses need a place like that?" she asked. The question stayed suspended between them, like flower dust in sunlight. The whispering grew in pieces, never malicious at first, only curious. A realtor approaching 60 didn't usually reinvent himself in rust and darkness. Still, when Margaret carried a warm loaf across the street 2 evenings later and found Samuel standing outside the warehouse with Ranger at his side, the welcome in her smile was genuine. Up close, Samuel looked exactly as he always did, kind-eyed, lined by experience, reserved without being cold. "Thought I'd lost track of you," she said lightly, offering the bread. "You've been hard to catch lately." He accepted with both hands, as though manners mattered more at night, and thanked her. Margaret's gaze drifted to the dark doorway behind him, where the scent of sawdust and old metal lingered. "Big project?" she ventured, tone gentle rather than accusatory. Samuel's smile faltered just slightly, so fleeting she might have missed it if she hadn't watched people for a living. "Just clearing out old things," he replied, deflecting without lying, his voice calm but carefully empty. He did not expand on it. Margaret studied him another moment, then nodded and wished him a good night, unsettled not by what he refused to say, but by how practiced his refusal felt. Ranger, meanwhile, accepted her presence gladly, sniffing at her apron and resting his chin briefly against her knee before returning to his post by the door, as if an invisible switch had been thrown. By the end of the week, Erin had seen it too. The way the dog softened with visitors and hardened instantly once darkness deepened. The way Samuel's work never spilled into daylight. The way sound traveled oddly from the building. 3 measured strikes of a hammer, a pause, then 3 more, as though someone were testing the patience of listening ears. The town's rhythm adjusted unconsciously around that hidden pulse. Doors closed a little earlier. Curious glances lingered longer. Speculation took root not in panic, but in the uneasy space where answers should have lived. Margaret tried twice more to draw Samuel into ordinary conversation about the market, about repairs, about whether he ever missed wherever he had come from. But each invitation met with the same courteous retreat. Erin, watching from across the street one evening with her son's hand wrapped in hers, found herself wondering what kind of work required a man to hide behind locked doors and a dog to guard the threshold like a living alarm. Inside the warehouse, Samuel worked with sleeves rolled and breath steady, sweat tracking slow along his spine as wood met metal and silence met intention. He did not think of the whispers. He thought only of measurements, of alignment, of making something that did not yet exist, but already felt necessary. Outside, Ranger shifted his weight without lying down, eyes never leaving the darkness beyond the door, as if he understood that whatever his master was building needed protection, not from thieves, but from eyes that were learning to look too closely. And the question the town could no longer dismiss was simple and dangerous in its persistence. If Samuel Reed truly had nothing to hide, why did everything about the way he worked suggest that he did? The first truck arrived just after noon, its engine cutting through the lazy hum of the main street like a foreign heartbeat, and by the time it rumbled past the cafe windows, every head inside had turned. It was not the kind of vehicle that belonged to the town. Too clean, too heavy, its sides marked with shipping labels from places people here only knew as names on maps. Men stepped down from the cab and moved with brisk efficiency, unloading stacks of fine lumber wrapped in plastic, long metal beams that flashed dull silver in the sun. And finally, a single wooden crate so long and narrow that the chatter inside the cafe faltered into something brittle and uncertain. By mid-afternoon, a second truck followed, then a third, all taking the same slow road toward the edge of town where Samuel Reed's warehouse waited in quiet defiance of its former neglect. Word moved faster than the wheels ever could. By the time the last vehicle disappeared beyond the trees, the story had already been built twice over, assembled from glances, half-seen shapes, and memories people thought they understood. In the cafe, where the coffee never stayed hot for long, and the windows always framed the street like a stage, the pieces came together with frightened logic. Samuel, former soldier, widowed to the past, living alone with his dog, working at night. Now, a crate shaped too much like a coffin to be coincidence. Someone whispered the word death. Someone else didn't argue. Margaret Ellis stood behind the cafe's front window, with flowers still dusting her hands, and watched the street empty again, her reflection pale against the glass. At 62, Margaret had learned to recognize fear before it announced itself. But this was a different kind, quiet, private, the kind that pulsed under the ribs and made the heart feel suddenly too soft for the body that carried it. She had seen loss in this town before. She had baked for funerals and sat in kitchens where voices had fallen into careful whispers. And now, standing there with the smell of bread still warm around her, she felt the cold touch of possibility settle against her spine. Across the room, Erin Walker lifted her coffee with a hand that trembled slightly, her eyes fixed on nothing at all. Erin was younger, weighed down more by tiredness than by years, and when she thought of Samuel Reed, She did not see mystery or secrets. She saw her son laughing in the early evenings when Ranger let him throw the old tennis ball across the grass. She saw the quiet man who had once crouched down and shown the boy how to hold his hand flat so a large dog did not feel threatened. The thought that Samuel might be preparing to die landed in her chest like a stone. She imagined her son asking where Ranger had gone, why the house on the edge of town stayed dark, and she found she had no answer strong enough to give him. By dusk, the rumors had hardened into something that felt dangerously close to conviction. People moved through the evening with a kind of careful restraint, voices lowered, steps slowed, eyes drifting again and again toward the road that led out of town. That night, the warehouse did not glow as it had before. No yellow light bled through imperfect boards. No steady percussion of hammer and saw marked the hours. Instead, the building sat in utter stillness, a dark mass against darker trees. And yet, it was not empty. Margaret crossed the street with a loaf of bread held tightly against her chest, more for courage than balance, and stopped at the curb that faced Samuel's property. The wind had shifted after sunset, carrying the smell of pine and metal toward her, and something else beneath it, oil perhaps, or fear shaped into scent. She waited for the familiar sounds of work to rise and reassure her with their stubborn normalcy. None came. What did come were soft, deliberate footsteps circling the yard, slow enough to slip between the spaces of her anxious listening. Ranger moved through the darkness like a watchful shadow, nails faintly tapping against gravel, his pace steady but restless. Once, a low sound escaped his throat. Not a bark, not a growl, but something in between. A sound that carried unease more than warning. Margaret's grip tightened around the bread. She could just make out the dog's shape as he passed beneath the narrow spill of moonlight, his head lifted, his ears turning as if he were listening for something no one else could hear. Somewhere inside the building, there was silence too complete to be accidental. Samuel's truck was there. The door was closed, but the life that had filled the space night after night had withdrawn into itself as if holding its breath. Margaret took one step forward and then stopped, unsure which part of her fear had moved her. Concern for a quiet man who never asked for help, or the instinctive dread that sometimes preceded loss. She did not call his name. She did not cross the road. She only stood there, the warm weight of bread cooling in her hands, and watched as the last faint light inside the warehouse vanished completely. The darkness that followed felt heavier than ordinary night, pressed with too many questions and not nearly enough answers. And as Margaret turned back toward the safety of the street lamp's glow, one thought followed her, like an echo that refused to fade. If the town waited until morning, would it already be too late to stop whatever Samuel Reed had set in motion? The wind carried a colder edge that morning, slipping down from the mountains like a warning Samuel Reed did not need to hear out loud, for the date itself already pressed against his chest with the weight of memory. It was the anniversary of a battle he never spoke about, a day he usually passed in quiet routines and unopened thoughts. But this year, he moved through it differently. People saw him that afternoon, unloading the long wooden crate from his truck, his red and black buffalo plaid jacket snug against his shoulders, his posture rigid with purpose rather than effort. Ranger walking so close at his side that their shadows touched. The crate was heavier than it looked, or perhaps it only appeared that way because Samuel lifted it without asking for help, his jaw set, his eyes focused on the warehouse door, as if everything else in the world had narrowed to that single threshold. Ranger's ears remained sharply tilted forward, his steps measured and tense, as if he sensed the gravity in his master's silence. The door closed behind them with a hollow metallic thud, and when the lock turned, the sound echoed farther than it should have in the quiet of late afternoon. Across the street, Margaret Ellis felt the noise travel through her like a second heartbeat. It should not have been alarming. A lock, a door, ordinary things, but nothing about this felt ordinary anymore. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and looked at Aaron Walker, who stood beside her, clutching her son's small hand. The boy had wide, anxious eyes and a knit cap pulled low over his dark hair, his gaze fixed on the warehouse as if he expected it to move. Neither woman said it aloud, but the same unspoken fear passed between them. Today might be the day the rumors stopped being rumors. Without fully deciding, they moved. A few neighbors followed at a distance, reluctant but unable to stay behind. The sound of the lock still rang in Margaret's ears as they reached the warehouse door. Inside, Samuel stood alone with the crate now resting at the far end of the room. The space had changed more than anyone outside could have guessed. Where dust and decay once ruled, warm-toned wooden walls had begun to take shape, their surfaces sanded smooth but left unfinished, breathing quietly with the scent of fresh work. Long wooden benches lined the floor in even rows, their legs solid, their placement precise. Empty frames hung on the walls, dozens of them, waiting without titles or names. The air was thick with sawdust and oil, and beneath it, something steadier, intention. Samuel rested one hand on the top of the crate, his fingers splayed as if grounding himself through the wood. The weight in his chest had nothing to do with what the town feared, and everything to do with what he carried. For a moment, he closed his eyes. Ranger paced once in a slow circle and stopped near the crate, his body aligned subtly with Samuel's, ready without knowing why. Outside, the voices grew closer, murmurs at first, then the scrape of footsteps. The neighbors hesitated at the door, listening for the sounds that might confirm their worst suspicions. Instead, they heard nothing but silence too deliberate to be empty. Margaret's breath came shallow as she reached for the handle. It was locked. Aaron's son squeezed her hand, and Ranger's low movement inside the building seemed suddenly louder through the barrier. Margaret knocked once, hard, calling Samuel's name. No answer came. Panic slipped into resolve. When they forced the door, the lock gave way with a sharp crack, wood splitting under shared fear and sudden strength. The scene that greeted them stole the air from every lung in the room. There was no rope, no bottles, no pills scattered across the floor. Instead, there was light, soft, honey-colored light spilling from hanging bulbs that revealed not a place of ending, but a place becoming. The half-built room stretched before them like a promise interrupted mid-sentence. Benches faced an open space where the wooden floor had been fitted with careful precision. The frames on the walls waited in expectant silence. At the far end stood the long wooden crate, now upright and open, revealing not the shape of death, but the careful beginnings of a raised display. Samuel stood in the middle of it all, dust smudged across his cheek, his jacket speckled with pale wood powder, his eyes wet and unguarded. For a long moment, no one moved. The weight of what they expected crashed headlong into what they saw, and the collision left only shock. Aaron's son gave a small, frightened sound, and Ranger immediately moved, circling toward him and pressing his large head gently into the boy's shaking leg. The child stilled, surprised, his hand slowly lowering into the fur at the dog's neck. Ranger remained there without shifting, a steady warmth against the boy's fear. It was enough. Samuel's voice, when it came, was not loud. "It isn't what you thought," he said simply. The words sounded inadequate even to him. Margaret found herself stepping forward without remembering how her feet had moved. "Then tell us what it is," she said, not accusing, not pleading, only needing. Samuel swallowed. He turned his gaze to the empty frames and the benches that had not yet held anyone. "I needed a place," he said, choosing each word as if it were a fragile object, "for people like me, and for the ones who never made it home." His breath caught, and for a moment, the soldier in him threatened to resurface, all discipline and restraint, but it passed. "Not a cemetery," he added quietly. "A place to be remembered by name, by face." He gestured toward the frames. "They'll hold photographs, stories, whatever families are willing to give." His hand moved back to the crate. "This is only the stand for it." Margaret's knees weakened with sudden release, and she had to lean against the doorframe to steady herself. Erin's free hand rose to her mouth as she stared at the empty benches, imagining them filled. The neighbors did not speak. The truth had landed among them, and it was not deadly, but it was heavy. Samuel stood with his shoulders straight and his face bare, more exposed than at any time since he had come to town. "I didn't know how to explain it," he admitted, "and I didn't trust myself to start talking about it without losing control." His gaze flicked once, involuntarily, to the empty space where a name would one day hang. "Some things get easier when you build instead of remember." Ranger lifted his head and moved back toward Samuel, his tail low but steady, as if completing a circuit between fear and truth. Aaron's son reached after him, reluctantly, then let go, the trembling in his shoulders already easing. The crowd's breath returned in uneven waves. The dangerous ending they had imagined had not come to pass, but something else had taken its place, something unresolved and unsettled in a different way. Margaret watched Samuel carefully, relief and unease twisting together beneath her ribs. She believed him. She believed the room and the intention that filled it. Yet belief did not explain the secrecy that still clung to him like a second skin, or the way his eyes flinched when the past brushed too close. The neighbors began to drift back toward the door in quiet, shaken steps, exchanging uncertain glances in the narrowing space between suspicion and understanding. Margaret lingered last. She looked at the crate once more, then at the frames waiting on the wall, and finally at the man who had built them. "This is a good thing you're making," she said softly. Samuel gave a small, weary nod, as though goodness were not something he trusted himself to hold for long. As the door closed behind them and the yard fell quiet again, the relief did not fully settle, for beneath the warmth of unfinished wood and the truth he had finally shared, one question remained unanswered, pulsing beneath the surface of everything. If this was only a memorial, why did Samuel still guard the unseen parts of his past as if they could yet destroy him? By the end of the week, the tone of the town had shifted from suspicion to something softer, almost ashamed of its own earlier fear. People spoke of the memorial room with quieter voices now, some with admiration, others with the kind of hesitant respect reserved for grief that was not their own. Margaret noticed customers lingering longer at the bakery, glancing down the street toward the warehouse with expressions that carried less doubt and more reflection. Even Erin seemed lighter, her shoulders no longer drawn tight every time her son asked about Ranger. Yet peace, Samuel knew better than most, often arrived just before something came to shatter it. The morning Victor Hale arrived, the town was wrapped in ordinary sunlight, the kind that made danger feel impossible. Samuel was inside his real estate office, reviewing listings in the familiar stillness of routine, when the low purr of an unfamiliar engine slid through the open window. The sound did not belong. It was too refined, too deliberate. He looked up, just as a sleek, dark sedan eased into the space directly in front of his door. The license plate bore the mark of another state. From behind the glass, Samuel watched the driver's door open, slow and measured, as if the man stepping out wanted to be seen. Victor Hale appeared to be in his early 50s, tall, with the lean build of someone who paid close attention to how he occupied space. His hair was the color of polished steel, combed neatly back from a narrow face, where a thin mouth rested in something that resembled a smile, without ever reaching the eyes. He wore a tailored gray suit that did not belong to the town, any more than his car did. The fabric caught the light as he straightened, immaculate, untouched by dust. Victor adjusted his cuff once, glanced at the building's plain front with mild interest, and stepped inside as though he had every right to be there. Samuel stood as Victor crossed the room. Their eyes met, and the past surged up between them without a word needing to be spoken. Victor's gaze flicked briefly to the red and black jacket hanging on the back of Samuel's chair, then to the military watch on his wrist. Recognition settled in his face with the ease of a man who had never had to look very hard for what he wanted. "Mr. Reed," he said pleasantly, "or do you prefer to be called by another name these days?" His voice was smooth, cultivated, the sound of someone used to being listened to. Samuel's jaw tightened. "What do you want, Victor?" he asked, his own voice steady, but stripped bare of warmth. Victor chuckled softly at the familiarity, as though they were old acquaintances rather than men bound by buried damage. He took in the modest office without comment and finally rested his attention on Samuel's face. "I hear you've been building something," he said. "Something sentimental." The word landed with faint ridicule. Samuel did not respond. Outside, Ranger lay near the Wasishcombe office doorway in the shade, ears lifting at the shift in air that followed Victor inside. The dog rose smoothly, the ridge of his back stiffening as he stepped into view. Victor's eyes flicked to him at last. "Still keeping watch," he murmured. "Some habits never fade." Victor did not waste time with pleasantries. He spoke of the old contract as if It were a business arrangement that had simply gone untidy. He reminded Samuel of the incident in careful, euphemistic language. The chemical leak labeled as an accident, the soldiers and nearby civilians who had fallen ill in numbers too small to become statistics, too large to be ignored by those who lived with the consequences. Samuel saw their faces again in the reflective sheen of Victor's shoes as the man paced the small room. Young men coughing into red cloths, neighbors closing windows that would not keep poison out. You understood, back then, why it had to be handled quietly, Victor said. Containment, discretion, stability. Samuel's hand drifted, almost without intention, to the dark strap of the military watch on his wrist. Time had stopped for him on that base in ways it never had for Victor Hale. And now, Victor continued, you've decided to build yourself a little shrine right in the open. That makes certain people nervous. He reached into his inner pocket and withdrew a folded document, placing it gently on the desk between them like an offering. An extraordinarily generous offer, he went on, for the warehouse and assistance relocating, somewhere far quieter than this. Samuel's eyes did not leave Victor's face. You want me gone, he said simply. Victor smiled thinly. I want you safe and silent, as you were. The word silent carried weight that went far beyond sound. Ranger took a step forward, slow and deliberate, placing himself squarely between Samuel and Victor. His ears were angled sharply back now, his chest lifted, a low vibration building behind his stillness. Victor noticed it and laughed under his breath. Even the dog knows, he said lightly. You and I both recognize a changing battlefield. Samuel lowered his hand from the watch and straightened. He thought of the empty frames waiting on the walls of the memorial room. He thought of the boy's small hand in Ranger's fur. He thought of names that had never been spoken out loud in public. This isn't just about me anymore, he said. Victor's smile faded a degree. It never was, he replied, but it can still be contained. He gestured faintly toward the warehouse down the street. Sell it, leave, take the money, start again somewhere that doesn't invite attention. Samuel felt the familiar pressure build behind his eyes, the urge to shrink the world back down to survival. For years, he had lived inside that space. It would be easy to step back into it. Too easy. Ranger's growl deepened, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. Outside, someone laughed on the sidewalk, unaware of how close the past had drawn to the present. Samuel looked at Victor and shook his head once. You made people sick, he said quietly. Victor's eyes hardened at last. I fulfilled an obligation, he corrected coldly, and so did you by staying quiet. Silence pulsed between them, thick with memory and the promise of consequence. Victor refolded the document and slid it back into his jacket. Think carefully, he warned. Industries survive on people who understand the value of leaving things buried. He cast one final glance at Ranger, who had not moved, and on those who know when their watch is over. Victor turned and left as precisely as he had entered, the door closing with a soft click that felt too gentle for what it sealed behind it. Samuel remained standing long after the sedan pulled away, the weight of the unspoken threat settling slowly into his bones. Ranger shifted then, his body brushing against Samuel's leg, the growl fading into a tense quiet. Samuel rested his hand on the dog's head, the tension beneath his fingers still coiled but steady. The offer, the warning, the memory of the base, all of it tangled in his chest with the faces of the people who now trusted him without knowing why. Through the office window, the town looked as it always had, calm, ordinary, unaware of the shadow that had just passed through it. And the question Samuel could no longer avoid rose with the slow certainty of a coming storm. If he refused to vanish this time, would Victor Hale stop at threats? Or would the cost of his choice fall on everyone who had finally begun to stand beside him? The wind did not rise suddenly that night. It had been building since dusk, working its way down from the mountains in steady, unsettling breaths that rattled the loose metal along the warehouse roof and whispered through the trees like a warning spoken too many times to ignore. Inside, warm light glowed against bare wooden walls as Margaret, Aaron, and a few neighbors moved slowly along the benches, lifting and aligning the first empty frames that would soon hold faces and names. Their voices were low, careful, as if the space itself asked for restraint. Samuel moved among them with quiet efficiency, ladder in one hand, measuring tape looped at his belt. The red and black plaid of his jacket darkened by shadow and sawdust. He gave direction without command, gratitude without weight. This was not labor born of secrecy anymore. It was shared. Ranger lay near Aaron's young son at first, his long body stretched in relaxed vigilance, the boy's small fingers tracing the edge of the dog's ear as the wind outside clawed at the walls. Then, without warning, Ranger's body tightened. His head snapped up, ears cutting sharply backward against the roar of the night beyond the building. The boy felt the shift before anyone spoke. Ranger rose in one smooth motion and moved toward the rear of the warehouse, a low, guttural sound building in his chest. Neither bark nor growl, but the ancient signal of threat. Samuel turned in the instant his instincts recognized the sound. "Everyone stay where you are," he said, voice calm, but edged with steel as Ranger surged toward the back door. The latch on the outside turned with a faint metallic complaint, too soft for ordinary ears, but not for a dog trained to listen for danger beneath noise. The door cracked open just enough for the night to spill in, and with it, the silhouette of a man holding a plastic can that caught the light with a dull, accusing gleam. The smell of gasoline reached the room a heartbeat later. Ranger lunged. The impact was brutal and precise. Ranger's jaws closed around the man's forearm as the intruder cried out in shock and pain, the can ripping from his grip and skidding across the wooden floor, spilling its contents in a thin, spreading arc that burned the air with sharp chemical heat. Samuel was already moving. The years he carried behind his eyes folded into his body in an instant, and he closed the distance with a speed that startled everyone who watched. He struck the man low, driving him backward into the wall, as Ranger released and repositioned without instruction. Tense, but controlled. The intruder collapsed to the floor, amid broken curses and sudden stillness. "Everyone out, now," Samuel ordered. Margaret did not hesitate. She pulled Aaron and her son toward the front door, while another neighbor reached for the light switch, plunging the main room into shadows to deny flame its easiest companion. Aaron's son stumbled once, terror overtaking his small legs, and Ranger moved to shield him, even with blood streaked along his own front paw, where teeth had torn skin in the struggle. Margaret's hands shook as she fumbled for her phone and called the police, her voice sharp, unsteady, relentless. Samuel dragged the struggling man away from the spreading gasoline and kicked the can out through the open back door into the night. Wind scattered the fumes, but the danger lingered, invisible and alive. Within moments, voices rose outside as neighbors drawn by the noise and the scent gathered despite the storm. Then, through the moving wall of rain and headlights, the sleek black sedan appeared. Victor Hale stepped from it with measured displeasure, rain slicking his tailored coat, his expression taut with irritation rather than fear. He took in the scene quickly, spilled fuel, the subdued intruder on the floor, Ranger standing bloodied but unbroken before Erin and her child, and Samuel at the center of it all, breathing hard beneath the snapping lights. "This was unnecessary," Victor said coolly, as if commenting on a business transaction that had gone poorly. "Messy." Samuel stepped forward, his jacket hanging open, his chest heaving, the watch at his wrist catching the light as he reached into the inner pocket and withdrew a thick stack of pages bound by clips and caution. Every set of eyes followed the movement. Rain slid from Victor's collar as he narrowed his gaze. "You're out of your depth," Victor warned. Samuel didn't raise his voice. "No," he said. "I'm done hiding in it." He lifted the documents. "These are copies, scanned, time-stamped, sent to multiple servers and private contacts, names, locations, medical reports, internal memos, and your signature, more than once." The wind ripped the edge of the pages, but Samuel held firm. "If anything happens to me, to anyone in this building, or to anyone in this town, everything goes public. Not whispered, not buried." Rain drummed against the warehouse roof as silence pressed down like a second storm. Victor's composure faltered for the first time, not in panic, but in calculation. His eyes flicked toward the watching crowd that had gathered at the threshold. Margaret, with her phone still clenched white-knuckled in her hand, Erin holding her son tight as Ranger stood in front of them like a living barrier, wounded but immovable, his amber eyes burning with warning. The police sirens were distant but unmistakable now, threading through the night with escalating insistence. Victor looked at Samuel again. "You think this protects you?" he asked quietly. "It protects everyone," Samuel answered. His voice did not shake. "That's the difference." Lightning fractured the sky, illuminating the ruined attempt at destruction in brutal clarity. The intruder moaned on the floor as the crowd murmured and tightened its semicircle. Ranger shifted his weight only once, teeth bared, not in attack, but in promise. Victor straightened slowly, rain plastering his hair as the sound of sirens grew louder. For a long second, no one moved. The fire that had almost been born was now smoke without flame, and the decision hung between threat and retreat like a blade balanced on air. Victor's gaze moved from the documents to the watching town and back to the wounded dog standing guard over a child who had nothing to do with old bases or buried contracts. Finally, Victor exhaled through his nose and stepped back into the rain. "You've made your position clear," he said coldly. "This isn't finished." The words were a warning, but they lacked their former certainty. He turned as the first police cruiser burst through the storm and cut its lights across the gathered faces. Samuel did not move as officers rushed in and took control of the scene. As the would-be arsonist was pulled to his feet in protest and cuffs, Ranger finally lowered his head, blood matting his paw, his body pressed still between Erin and the night. As Samuel knelt to touch the dog gently, his hand trembling only now that the danger had passed, the question none of them yet dared to answer pulsed through the wreckage and the rain alike. Would Victor's retreat hold, or had Samuel's refusal just ignited a battle that would no longer stay in the shadows? Weeks later, the old warehouse no longer smelled of gasoline or fear, but of warm wood, fresh bread, and something quieter still, belonging. The carved sign above the wide front doors read, "The House of Memory and Hope," its letters simple and steady, as if they had always waited for this name to exist. What once had been secrecy and suspicion now opened its doors each morning to soft voices, careful footsteps, and the low murmur of lives learning how to rest again. Half of the great wooden room held the memorial Samuel had built with his own hands. The once empty frames now filled with photographs of men and women in uniform, faces young and old, some smiling, some solemn, all finally named. The other half had been shaped into modest living quarters for those who had nowhere else to land yet, beginning with Erin and her son, whose small room overlooked the yard where sunlight pooled in the afternoons. There was also a quiet wing at the back for retired service and rescue dogs, where old paws could lie down without being forgotten. On opening day, the town gathered in a way it never had before, not in alarm, not in judgment, but in recognition. Samuel stood near the doorway in his familiar red and black jacket, boots newly polished but still worn at the heel, Ranger seated at his side with a faint limp that each passing day made smaller. For the first time since the past had found him again, Samuel did not feel the need to watch the edges of the crowd. The danger had gone quiet. What remained was work and people and something like peace. Life did not become dramatic after that. It became steady. By day, Samuel returned fully to his work as a real estate broker, walking clients through sunlit living rooms and narrow porches with a smile that no longer felt borrowed. He still wore the same cream shirt under his jacket, still checked his military watch without thinking, but the weight behind those habits had shifted. In the evenings, he crossed the short distance back to the House of Memory and Hope with Ranger at his side, the dog's gait growing stronger, his attention still sharp. They patrolled not out of fear now, but out of ritual, a quiet promise that the building and the people inside it were not alone. Erin found her footing again within those walls. She learned the rhythms of the place quickly, helping with meals, organizing the modest living spaces, and answering the visitors who came seeking rest rather than spectacle. Her son laughed more than he had in months, his small voice echoing off the wooden walls as he chased Ranger across the yard in games that never demanded more strength than joy. Sometimes he stopped at the framed photographs and asked questions that were simple and heavy at once, and Samuel answered him when he could, teaching memory without forcing sorrow. Margaret came often. At first she brought bread and quiet conversation, sitting beside Samuel on the front steps as Ranger dozed between them, the world slowing into the easy pace of dusk. Later, her visits lingered. Words were fewer. Glances did most of the talking. Their hands brushed, separated, returned without ceremony. It was not a love that rushed forward, only one that recognized itself as already present. On the evening of the first sunset, after the dedication ceremony, the town gathered again, not in crowds, but in clusters. Some sat on the front steps, others on the benches inside the memorial hall, where laughter now mixed freely with the stories being told. Samuel stood apart for a moment, watching from the threshold as voices rose and fell like tides. He saw Margaret laughing softly with Aaron, while Ranger lay stretched near their feet, his eyes half closed in working contentment. He saw the boy lifting himself onto the nearest bench to peer at the photographs, as if the faces might speak back. The wind moved gently that evening, not with warning, but with ease, lifting the corners of jackets and carrying with it the scent of baked bread and pine. Samuel felt something inside him loosen that he had carried so long it had begun to feel like bone. He stepped forward then, not as a builder, not as a soldier, not as a man under pursuit, but simply as himself. Someone asked him about the construction of the place, and he answered without shrinking from his own skill. Someone thanked him, and for the first time, he did not deflect the gratitude. Later, as the light slipped fully into gold, Samuel sat on the front steps with Margaret close beside him. Their shoulders touched, steady and unhurried. Ranger slept, with his head resting near Samuel's boot, breath deep and trusting. No one spoke of Victor. No one needed to. The past had not vanished, but it no longer determined the shape of the present. As the sun dipped behind the dark line of the mountains, the last of the stories faded into comfortable quiet. The town did not disperse all at once. People lingered, reluctant to break the moment. Samuel watched them with a strange tenderness, aware that this small crowd, once suspicious, once frightened, had become something like family. For decades, he had believed that survival required distance, that safety lived only in being unseen. Now, surrounded by voices and wooden walls he had raised from splinters and silence, he understood the deeper truth he had avoided. Survival also required being known. Margaret's hand found his at last, resting there without question. He clasped it gently, not as a promise of anything loud, but as an answer to what had already been asked between them. Ranger shifted closer, as if to complete the shape of that quiet triangle. The house of memory and hope stood behind them, its windows glowing softly, holding both grief and shelter without asking either to disappear. For the first time in a very long life shaped by duty and loss, Samuel did not feel like a man waiting for the past to catch him. He felt, simply, like someone who had arrived. And as the evening cooled and the first stars emerged above the roofline, the only question left for him was not what he had escaped, but how much good he could still choose to build with the time that remained. Sometimes, God doesn't send miracles as lightning from the sky. Sometimes, he sends them as a lonely man with a wounded heart, a faithful dog, and a simple place where broken people are finally seen. This story is a reminder that no matter how heavy your past is, God is never finished with your life. Even in the quietest corners, He can grow hope where we thought nothing could rise again. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need a little light today. Leave a comment to let us know what you felt. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories of faith, healing, and second chances. May God bless you, protect you, and fill your days with peace, strength, and quiet miracles.